Hey there, everyone. It's Christy, and I've not seen you guys for a few days now. You've heard my voice, but you've not seen me, and I wanted to provide a video where I wrap up my impressions of what happened in New Hampshire and also look ahead to South Carolina. And it's been, wow, very exciting on the Republican side of the race. There's been some really interesting results now from New Hampshire, and also going into South Carolina. It's a completely different setting. So let's just go ahead. I'm going to swap over to the slides that I've prepared for this talk, and we will have a look at those instead of me just sort of babbling randomly, because this is why I prepare notes, so that I talk about things in an organized way. Right, so first things first is to get the screen up. There we go. In the video that I put out on the night of the New Hampshire results before they started coming out, I think I wrapped up a little bit. The polling took longer than planned because of all the participants, so I was off air for a while before the results came in. But in that video, I mentioned that what was really exciting to me as a political scientist was the fact that we have what's almost like a natural experiment happening for political scientists to observe in the Republican election runoff. And this natural experiment I would look at as an experiment that would test the approach of the old school campaigning, which is voter banks, knocking on doors, personal contact, phone calls to remind people to vote, or that kind of just person-to-person lists with, of party people getting friends to call friends or get friends to bring friends to the polls. All of that is the sort of traditional way of doing politics. And I've observed in other videos that I see Donald Trump as sort of the first 21st century candidate, in that he is heavily reliant on social media and media in general. He has, instead of relying on paid media or interviews to get his views across, he tweets. And when he tweets, he makes news. This is a very different approach to engaging with voters. And the other interesting thing about the Trump approach is that he has not been engaging in the traditional campaign tactics as well as using this new social media tool. So he's really deficient when it comes to the ground game in terms of this race, but he is a master at social media. And what I said in the video during the New Hampshire primary, waiting for the results to come out, was that as a political scientist, I was super excited because the structure of the race, and maybe I can just stop sharing and I'll look at my screen. You guys can look at me a little bit maybe, but the structure in Iowa was such that it was a caucus state, which requires more effort. And there's only certain, it's not like a poll where you can go all day and just drop off your ballot. You have to be there at a specific time, and you have to wait for things to happen. And it's quite a commitment in terms of your time and your schedule. And the advantage that Cruz had was that he had the kind of networks that could get people to those events and keep them there. But Donald Trump was ahead in the polls. So Donald Trump had more support, and Ted Cruz was out there working the undecided voters and people that were already his supporters to get out there. And the result was that even though Trump was ahead in terms of how many people were supporting him, Cruz made the effort to get people to the polls. And that difference of getting people to the polls meant that Trump left basically money on the table, if you want to consider it that way, voters on the table. He left people out there who supported him who didn't make it to the caucus. And that might have been the explanatory factor as to why Cruz won and Trump lost, because of a lack of ground game. So we had this situation where we have these two different approaches to campaigning, and we put that approach into Iowa, which is a caucus state, and we had a result. We found out that ground game matters, campaigns matter. Then we move on to New Hampshire, and in New Hampshire, it's a different situation. You still have the same factors in terms of the old school versus the new school campaigning, but in New Hampshire, it was a primary, and it was an open primary. So the cost for participating relative to Iowa caucus goers was much lower. And what we found was that when you had a situation where the cost of voting was lower, and people across the political spectrum who had an opportunity to vote in either the Democratic or the Republican primary, so you could have whatever you wanted, then in that case the polls did a very good job of predicting support, because the people who went out to vote were very similar in terms of their percentage in the distributed population of voters to what we were seeing in the polls. And Trump won that, even though he didn't have a massive ground game. And Ted Cruz managed to come in third in New Hampshire, which I do think that it is more impressive for him to come in third in New Hampshire than Marco Rubio, because he is not really a good fit. So again, this sort of speaks to his ground game. And Ted Cruz went out and whined that Marco Rubio got more coverage for coming in third in Iowa. But then again, Marco Rubio went out and was the first person, if I'm remembering this correctly, to give any kind of speech. And he basically gave the speech like he won the damn thing, not that he came in third. So Cruz can whine about that, but the fact is that Marco just made a tactically smart move in terms of determining his narrative, whereas Cruz got buried by the Trump result because it was the first time Donald Trump had won anywhere. So that was very exciting. This shows that in this case, the campaign, in so far as getting a traditional ground game, getting the usual door knocking voter contact on election day, it didn't matter to Trump's result. It didn't hurt him in terms of losing the race to not have that traditional campaign infrastructure. And so then we had a different result, right, where Trump comes in first and Cruz comes in third, and then John Kasich, who's come in second at, I think he had 18% behind Trump. And I think in some ways he might have been the alternative to the traditional establishment candidates, in that, you know, people have Bush fatigue or just don't really connect with Jeb, even though he didn't perform in the top three. So in my book, he's a loser. Rubio, of course, had his disastrous debate performance that really tripped him up again. He just can't capitalize on his opportunities. And this is a theme that I pointed out about Marco Rubio since I started the series. He has an opportunity. He was doing a really good job going into that New Hampshire election, and then he just tripped over his own 2 feet. So, you know, that was an interesting, so in terms of, I'm sorry, I kind of gone off on a tangent here and forgot what my initial point was, but in terms of the New Hampshire results, it was a different result from Iowa given different conditions. So now we get to change the conditions and run the experiment again. And in this case, we're running it in South Carolina. And South Carolina is a slightly different, well, it has some of the elements of Iowa in that it has a much larger evangelical base that favored Ben Carson and Ted Cruz and probably Marco Rubio to a smaller extent last time in Iowa. And so we've got a Cruz advantage in terms of the natural population that's in the state. But it is a primary, which is closer to New Hampshire. Now, I'm pretty sure it's a closed primary, so you have to be a Republican or declare yourself as a Republican in order to participate in that election. But it still has the lower cost of getting to the polls, which we saw favored Trump, but it has the evangelical base that responds well to a voter turnout game, which we saw worked for Cruz in Iowa. So again, from an experimental point of view, to me, it's like the best thing ever watching the Republicans do this, because it shows the importance of campaigns and also the structures, the political structures of a state and the political norms of a state. And coming on to South Carolina, the norms of South Carolina are much different from the norms of Iowa and New Hampshire. Whereas in Iowa, there's sort of, you know, the Midwestern nice, and people respond well to personal contacts and this one-on-one small group voter interactions. And in New Hampshire, people are quite independent, and they're not so demographically led, like the evangelical base that sort of rallies around a particular vision of America. That doesn't sell in New Hampshire. So candidates voters are looking for different things from their candidates, and how they pitch it has to still be, well, we saw Donald Trump saying things in political rallies that have not been said before, and the crowd loving it. So there's a kind of earthy, shall we say, authenticity to people in New Hampshire that they don't kind of have the same outlook in terms of what is appropriate and inappropriate as we do in South Carolina. Now, South Carolina, I find kind of schizophrenic. Not schizophrenic, that's a wrong word, but it's a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because on the one hand, it's supposed to be a state that's made up of very nice, polite people who are good Christians. And yet it is also the state which has a reputation for the absolute worst, most disgusting, vile kinds of dirty tricks And the voters, those supposedly good Christians, reward candidates for playing dirty tricks, at least in the past. We saw John McCain get crushed there by a terrible whisper, a racist whisper campaign that was led by Karl Rove, and Bush will deny it, but yeah, and this goes all the way back. This goes deep in the evangelical / Christian / morally conservative Republican Party in South Carolina. And it's actually disgusting what people have done there in the past. So this is the dynamic where the candidates now are walking into a state that, in theory, you're supposed to be a good Christian, go to church on Sunday and be nice to people. But as soon as, you know, the cameras turn away or you're in private, the mask drops and the monsters come out. And we're going to see what kind of monsters come out in South Carolina. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and go back and go ahead and put on my sharing again, share my screen, because now I really do have things for you guys to look at. Right. Okay, so the other thing that I just should mention quickly is the fallout of New Hampshire, which was that Chris Christie got out and Carly Fiorina got out. I read a piece in Politico today that was talking about Christie's donors, and 2 of them have gone to Kasich. So that's an interesting, for me, it's slightly interesting to see where the establishment goes now that the establishment candidates have basically failed to do anything meaningful in 2 of the last 2, the first 2 elections held for their party's nomination. And it would seem to me to make sense, and although I don't have crosstabs on this, that Fiorina's supports are going to go more to outsiders than insiders. And Christie's supports, at least his donors, seem to be going for other establishment people like Kasich. So that seems that makes sense. Now, I wanted to update you on the Real Clear Politics poll of polls. These numbers are unfortunately a little bit dated. So the most recent result on here was a Quinnipiac, which ran from the 2nd to the 4th of February. This was before Marco Rubio's disastrous impact. I think that the numbers here like run to the 7th, but the data only goes to the 4th. And if I'm remembering this correctly, their debate was on the 6th. So they this doesn't have yet picked up on any loss of support or momentum Marco Rubio had as a direct consequence of his poor debate performance with Chris Christie. So we don't know what these numbers are in the real population yet because we've got a lag on the data. We have to wait for the data to come in. You can see Ted Cruz here is just, he's really done, this is like a really good trend line for a candidate, to be honest. This shows quite a lot of just slow and steady momentum. The only thing Cruz would probably want is to have it a steeper slope so that it doesn't take him as long to intersect with Donald Trump. Right now, he's looking, you know, we're going weeks and months out, and this is also based on an assumption that Trump's numbers here will remain under 30%, which we've seen before, especially, and this doesn't reflect his New Hampshire win either, that Trump really tends to float between 30, or at least for the last several months, he's been floating between 30 and 35% nationally. And now that he's going to have a winner status, I would imagine that this too would shoot back up as a consequence. So we'll see in the next round of polling numbers if Marco Rubio has a big drop off and if Donald Trump has a nice spike. And we'll also be looking at how Ted Cruz is doing here in terms of, is he maintaining this slow and steady increase as the negative ads in New Hampshire and South Carolina, like a lot of 2-word states. And I'm being from Wisconsin, I just say 1 word. I'm not used to saying 2 words. So we'll see if he has really taken down a peg in South Carolina by Trump, because it is kind of undoubted now that Trump is rounding on Cruz and beating him with the same kind of enthusiasm that he used to love to smack up Jeb Bush with. Ben Carson could potentially be a problem for Ted Cruz since he's not got out of the race, he's going to suck away those evangelicals that would otherwise probably be quite amenable to Cruz. So the longer that Carson stays in the race, the worse it is for Cruz, because I think he's sucking up some of Cruz's oxygen with voters. So here's a few things you need to know about South Carolina. The vote will be taking place on the 20th of February. Pretty sure it's a closed primary. Only registered Republicans can vote. If that's wrong, I will stick in an errata, in an annotation in a future video. The state itself is more evangelical than New Hampshire, although I don't know that it's as evangelical as Iowa. Again, I'll have to look at the demographic numbers on there. The state itself, in terms of the Republican side of the race, is really known for dirty tricks. These include whisper campaigns. One of the whisper campaigns was that John McCain had fathered a black baby out of wedlock. What the race of the child has to do with it, I really don't know, other than to scare white voters and tap into racism, I guess. And people spread lies. There was also a whisper campaign that John McCain had used prostitutes and gave his wife VD. This is all coming from a coverage that I watched the other evening of Rachel Maddow's coverage of how dirty South Carolina vote is, and or at least electioneering is, and push calls, where people will just call you up and say, hey, did you know that the person you like is a complete, horrible, awful person who, decides to kill puppies in his spare time and has a torture chamber in his basement? Oh, yeah, you really shouldn't vote for him. This is the kind of stuff that in the past has been able to slide under the radar, because people, unless you had an answering machine that had the ability to record those push calls, those live interactions just happen and they're gone. They're really difficult to document. And quite often these push call, the people who are doing them will not declare who where their funding comes from or what candidate they're working on behalf. But as people have their mobile phones and can record conversations very easily, or document these things in other ways, put them up online, these kinds of dirty campaign tricks are going to be brought more and more into the light in the age of social media, I would predict. And some candidates might be held accountable, or at least be associated with some kind of negative tactic or negative campaign push that previously they could have argued a plausible deniability about. Now, the next slide is the latest polling results for South Carolina. And if you've watched the series for a while, you know that quite often I don't go into South Carolina data because it's been really bad. And it's been bad because people just haven't been polling there. This is the most recent information, and it's just one data point. So this isn't, I think we have now, unfortunately, not the high quality data that we've had in the caucus and New Hampshire in terms of leading up to South Carolina. There will probably be a lot more done in the way of polling now that the attention of the media has turned to South Carolina. But in some ways, you should consider this the first observation over the next week, and then we can look to see, as more polling data comes in, whether or not these patterns are confirmed by future data, or if future data results are quite different in showing, a different pattern of who's coming in second, third, or fourth, that sort of thing. But previous polling showed Donald Trump well ahead with a very, very sustained lead. That is still the case in this most recent poll. Ted Cruz, again, this is a natural state for him, so he should come in second in South Carolina. Marco Rubio at 15%, so we'll have to see whether or not his perception as a viable candidate is if he recovers it, or if the narrative about his incompetence starts to set in. Jeb Bush has to make a stand here. He's got double digits, which is good for him, I guess. Whenever he's out of single digits, that's been pretty impressive for Jeb so far this campaign season. John Kasich, while having a win in New Hampshire, I don't know that he has the money or the infrastructure or the messaging in order to really capitalize on that second place victory. And Ben Carson, the guy's off. There's a phrase in the UK when you're like off with the fairies, and that's, you're in your own little la la land. I always think of it as being off with the fairies as being in like a little magical wood with, like a clearing and trees and like sort of, hippie children dancing. And that's where Ben Carson is. He doesn't live in the real world. He's off in La La Land, where he thinks he's actually, got a chance to run for president of the United States. And he's not been a viable candidate for months now. He just hasn't figured that out yet. So as long as he's around, he's just going to take that 5%. I would imagine at least 3 or 4% of that would go to Ted Cruz if Carson wasn't in the race. So really the most spiteful thing that Ben Carson can do to get back at Ted Cruz is just to stay in the race and complain about Ted Cruz for as long as the money goes. As long as he can ride that money train and just fire all of his ire, fire all his weapons at Ted Cruz and bring him down with evangelicals as revenge for Iowa. Well, that helps Donald Trump, and it helps the other establishment candidates too. So we'll have to see whether or not Ben Carson is a vindictive person or if he's the good Christian he claims to be. For South Carolina, this is what I'll be watching between now and the 20th of February, starting with, and I'm just going to go in order of the candidates that were in that last slide, the polling slide. So Trump in Iowa left, from my estimates, anywhere between 5 and 7% of his supporters on the table by not having a ground game, by not actually organizing in a meaningful way to get the people who were supporting him in the polls to actually cast their ballots. Now, New Hampshire validated his social media / media-driven voter engagement approach. So the question is, when you move to a state that does still have, that strong evangelical base, and where turnout could make a difference, depending on how Cruz does catching up with him in South Carolina, has Trump learned his lesson about having a ground game? Or has New Hampshire given him a false sense of security that he doesn't have to spend money on turning out the vote because people like him so much? I think that's a rather dangerous thing for a candidate to rely on when voters can be quite fickle, and a week is a lifetime in politics. So will Trump start spending money getting a ground game together? Will the whisper campaigns that we know Cruz is behind, and probably Rubio and others as well, will those whisper campaigns soften his numbers as we get closer to Election Day? And can Trump actually convert support in the polls to people turning out and voting? That's what I'll be looking at as we move forward between now and the South Carolina primary. In terms of Cruz, after coming a respectable third, he really needs a win in South Carolina. If he actually was able to pull out a win here, it would be his best chance of knocking Trump out of his sort of first place status, but also his front runner status. Because Iowa was not, it was a surprise insofar that Trump underperformed based on the polling because he didn't have a ground game. In part, I don't want to say that's 100% of the variation in the difference between his polling numbers and his caucus results, but it was certainly a large contributor of the variance to the difference between those numbers. And in New Hampshire, Trump performed exactly how he should have performed based on the polling data. So if the polling data in a state where they're having a primary and not a caucus is one in which Ted Cruz is able to out-organize Trump underneath his own nose and pull out a win, that would be huge for the Cruz campaign. So look for Cruz to play up being a good Christian and saying all the right things, all the while running a dirty, lie-filled campaign. We've seen it already with him. We saw it with what he did to Ben Carson, and we're hearing already rumors of these push polls that are hitting people, people are getting calls in South Carolina already. Ted Cruz, as I've said almost in every single video, is the little finger of this race, and he's he's a scumbag. It's just like that. He has no sense of honor in terms of being two-faced. He'll say one thing to the camera, and then he'll say another thing to his activists. He'll say one thing about gay marriage, as he just did over recently, about needing to stand up to defeat people's right for marriage equality while he's in South Carolina, but then tell funders, donors in Manhattan that it's really not one of his most important issues. So, he's really not only the sort of classic politician who talks out of both sides of his mouth. He is basically demonstrated repeatedly that he has no scruples in terms of winning, and that he will do whatever it takes, that the ends justify the means. So the question is he going to pay a price for that with evangelical voters? But, if he does get the better of Trump by using these dirty tactics, he might be able to upend the polling data and get him the win. So this is, for me, like how Cruz operates in South Carolina, how the voters react to his tactics, and the fallout from whatever the results are the things that I'm most interested in watching in this race. In terms of Rubio, he again was given an opportunity to take the establishment lane and really become the alternative in the lead up to New Hampshire, and he blew it. And he blew it in his debate exchange with Christie. So the advantage that Rubio has that I see in terms of coming into South Carolina is that Trump and Cruz are just going to be locked into a mud-throwing cage match for every single day. I think every single day the insults from back and forth will just be nonstop. And it's weird how people have this idea of South Carolina as this place for dirty politics. And so in some ways it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they do exactly what is expected of them. And to be honest, you know, there's only so much negative crap that voters can put up with before they just start tuning out. And sometimes they tune out to the point where they start looking for an alternative. The question is, can Rubio step around them and make a case that he is an alternative, that it can rise above the sort of, you know, dirty tricks of Ted Cruz and the foul-mouthed nature of Donald Trump? But we also know that based on his previous performance, he tends to waste these opportunities. So there is I think, a narrative setting in that he's just not ready. He's not ready for prime time. He's really not ready in this election cycle. He needs to go away and grow up a little bit and get a bit more experience and learn how to speak off the cuff a bit more, and all these kinds of criticisms that people have been directing at Rubio. The question is, has that narrative set in, or can he still redefine himself to the voters of South Carolina? Bush. This might be his last chance to justify his existence as a presidential candidate. If he can't win in South Carolina, where can he win? And the question for the Bush campaign is, will he be spending his time and effort attacking the frontrunner, or is he going to be spending his time and effort tearing down his fellow establishment rivals like Marco Rubio, like John Kasich? And that's the real moral crisis, I think, in the Bush campaign, is he has to decide who he's going to fight. And from the reporting I saw, and again, this was a piece in Politico, that it looks like the spending and the ad machine that's being geared up is going against Rubio. So it looks like it's more of a circular fire squad within the establishment sphere than anyone really trying to stop Trump from becoming the next GOP nominee for the White House. So that is what I'm going to be looking for in terms of the Bush campaign. He's brought in his brother, George is coming in to speak on behalf of Jeb. That, I guess, will work in South Carolina. I can't think of many states where bringing in W will actually improve people's estimates of his brother, but South Carolina is one of those states. And he always said he was his own man and that he was very different from his family. He loved his family, but he was his own man. Yeah, you know what? Not so much. No, he's definitely going, please, mommy, daddy, bro, help me. I can't do it by myself. Come and prop me up. The question is whether or not that machine is going to be enough to get him into, you know, a respectable second place finish above Ted Cruz. The question facing Bush after South Carolina is, if he can't win there, is it time for him to get out of the race? Because it really doesn't look any better after this. And if he can't kind of bring down Trump in the trap that is the dirty mud pit of South Carolina politics in the GOP side, well, if he can't do it when he is basically carte blanche to say the most obnoxious lies and to use the dirtiest tactics possible without really a lot of repercussions, and he can't do it there, then where is he going to ever try to win based on just, you know, like going toe-to-toe with Trump? In terms of Carson, I just really look for him in the next week to complain about Ted Cruz and make an effort to pull away some of the evangelical votes, which is Carson's revenge. And Cruz does have a problem. He really, for the benefit he got out of making up lies about, or his campaign, I know Ted Cruz will deny plausible deniability, it wasn't me, but his campaign, in terms of the benefit they got from making up that lie about Ben Carson, they're paying a really long price. And I think the price is not worth the small short-term benefit given how many voters he had in comparison with Trump. Ted Cruz's campaign did not need to lie about Ben Carson in order to win Iowa, but that stink of his dirty tricks and the fact that Carson's going to be there on the debate stage and be going around the state reminding people that the so-called evangelical Cruz did that to the other evangelical Carson, yeah, that's a pretty high price for a very minimal benefit, in my opinion. And I think Kasich, in some ways, is almost better placed than Rubio to fill that anti-Trump alternative, because he's had a positive message coming out of New Hampshire. He doesn't have quite the dirty hands that the other candidates have had in terms of their just pissing matches back and forth. They're like, on the debate stages. Kasich hasn't really had that kind of fireworks for, I think, a while. He took on Trump a couple of debates ago, but nobody remembers it. And if Rubio is, the narrative around Rubio not being ready is set, then it might be the case that, yeah, you do have Kasich as the sunny-faced alternative for the establishment. The thing that I don't really see in terms of that as being a credible narrative is that he just doesn't have the money. And there's not much in the way of momentum for him coming out of New Hampshire. South Carolina doesn't really seem to be that impressed if we look at those poll numbers. So, Kasich, I think I'm not expecting much from him. In fact, the question for me is, when is Kasich going to get out of the race? Because I don't see a path forward for him. So, but of course, I could be wrong. I haven't really been so wrong yet in my analysis, but well, we'll see. I'm sure I'll be wrong in the future. These are just some screen grabs that I had. We've got Donald Trump complaining, how can Ted Cruz be an evangelical Christian when he lies so much and is so dishonest? And if Ted Cruz doesn't clean up his act, stop cheating and doing negative ads, I have standing to sue him for not being a natural born citizen. Okay, and the first one, and I'm going to stop sharing here. On the first point, Ted Cruz, Donald Trump has already set up this narrative that he planted seeds of doubt over the idea that that evangelicals come out of Cuba. And I think the whole point of his purpose is carrying that forward is that he thinks he can get at his credibility. And to be honest, Ted Cruz handed him a ton of ammunition by acting like a jerk, by acting like a dick to Ben Carson in Iowa. And then also, now we're into a state where dirty tricks are being played, and all kinds of dirty tricks can be attributed to the Ted Cruz campaign. So going after his authenticity as a Christian, I think is a really interesting take that only Donald Trump would advance, because he does talk out of both sides of his mouth. And he also does not walk the walk when it comes to being a Christian in the GOP political arena. He's a scumbag. So I think Trump has actually got him on that. The question is, to what extent will voters take that on board? And I did a semester of constitutional law at my undergraduate, and from that I know that just because somebody's mean to you, that does not give you legal standing to sue them. So Donald Trump's final comment about, if he keeps doing this, I'll have standing. No, standing is a legal concept as to who has the right to file a lawsuit. So I don't have the right to file a lawsuit on behalf of somebody in Flint, Michigan who's being poisoned, because I don't have standing. I am not personally affected by their water crisis. But someone who's lived there and has drunk the water and has bathed their children in it, they are obviously have a personal case to sue the city or whatever else. They have standing. They have legitimacy. And standing in terms of Ted Cruz being on the ballot really comes down to decisions by election boards and candidates who are filing who say this person's not eligible to be on the ballot with me. That gives you standing, not being mean to somebody. So Donald Trump, lots of things that he doesn't know about. One, legal concept of standing. Two, that was the other thing he was saying the other day that was absolutely ridiculous. I can't remember. Oh yeah, I think it was my assessment that he thinks polling numbers are like viewer ratings, that they're like TV ratings, that somehow if people say they're going to do something, they actually are going to do it. And people don't. People quite often do other than what they say, even if they meant what they thought they were going to do at the time. So, and when Donald Trump figures that out and has a good ground game, then he will be a really formidable candidate. So that is my presentation. Those are my thoughts on the fallout from New Hampshire and also looking ahead to South Carolina. And it's, I think I saw the Daily Show, Trevor Noah was talking about, made a comment about something someone had said on Twitter, and said the 2020 presidential race, but we don't have to talk about that for another 9 months, which I thought was really funny, because it is true that if you think about it, this series, I think I started it just after Scott Walker got out, because I made a video about Scott Walker getting out of the race, and then I decided to make more. And so I probably started this in September of last year. And honestly, we're only through 2 of the first elections, and we're going to have to go through November of this year. So in some ways, it is insane that I've been doing this for so long and we're only finally getting started. But on the other hand, I know that the next few months are going to go really quickly, and it's going to be a fascinating, fascinating election to watch. So thanks for listening to my thoughts, and I appreciate your time and attention. I've been Christy. You guys have been awesome. And if there is any big political events, I will certainly do another video, maybe between now and the South Carolina primary. I have to make sure I say the right state. I have to be very deliberate, because there's a lot of interchange of Iowa, New Hampshire. Which place am I talking about? So if I slow down to say South Carolina, it's because I'm remembering that's the next primary. I will be in all likelihood doing something on the night, like I did with New Hampshire and did with Iowa. And that's just to keep you guys a little bit entertained while you're waiting for the results to come out. And I would imagine that I'll probably carry that on right up until election night. And in the election night of 2016, I'll have to decide if I'm going to have like friends over or how I'm going to work that, because that's going to be a long night, but really exciting one as well. All right, I'm going to stop talking now so you guys can get on with your life. I can get on with my day. And I already told you you're awesome, but just to kind of wrap things up, I've been Christy. You've been awesome. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.